In 1692, a shadow fell over colonial Massachusetts. It was a time of absolute fear, of paranoia, of deadly accusations that would become one of the darkest chapters in all of American history. We're talking, of course, about the Salem Witch Trials.
Think about that number for a second. 20 people, men and women, were legally executed by the state for a crime they absolutely did not and could not commit. And that's not even the whole story. On top of that, over 200 more were formally accused. Their lives, their families, their reputations, all shattered by the very same charge. So what was this terrible crime? It was witchcraft, a supposed pact with the devil. And that single impossible accusation was enough to turn neighbor against neighbor and send an entire community spiraling into total madness. You know, this wasn't just some simple witch hunt. We're talking about a complete societal breakdown, and it was fueled by this potent mix of deep-seated paranoia, religious extremism, and a legal system that just utterly failed its people.
So the big question is, how on earth did this happen? Well, it wasn't just one single spark. It was more like a powder keg, just sitting there waiting to blow.
You have to understand, the pressure in Salem was coming from all sides. You had this incredibly rigid Puritan worldview where any little thing that was different was suspect. There was political chaos, a constant, gnawing fear from recent brutal frontier wars. And then, simmering right underneath it all, you had bitter family feuds over land and money. It really, truly was the perfect storm for hysteria. And this right here, this really gets to the heart of their mindset. For the Puritans, the devil wasn't just some story you told kids. Oh no, he was a real active enemy in their day-to-day lives. A failed crop, a sick child, that wasn't just bad luck. It was seen as a potential attack by Satan, carried out by his followers on earth. Witches. That belief shaped their entire reality. So in this incredibly tense atmosphere, all it took was one strange event to light the fuse.
It all started in the home of the local minister, Samuel Parris. His young daughter and his niece started having these terrifying, unexplainable fits. When the doctor couldn't find any natural cause, he made a diagnosis that would change everything. The girls, he said, were bewitched.
Now, under intense pressure to name names, the afflicted girls finally pointed their fingers. And just look at who they accused. Tituba, an enslaved woman. Sarah Good, a homeless beggar. And Sarah Osborne, a sickly woman tangled up in a property dispute. They were the perfect scapegoats, women on the absolute margins of society with no power to fight back. The witch hunt had officially begun. As these accusations spread like wildfire, the colony's legal system didn't just bend, it completely shattered, and that's what allowed this hysteria to become state-sanctioned murder. The governor, William Phipps, set up a special court to handle the crisis. But here's the fatal flaw, and it was baked in from the very start. It was run by powerful men who, yeah, they were respected, but they had zero legal training. They were believers, not objective jurists. So what went on inside that courtroom? I mean, it is the exact opposite of what we think of as justice. Imagine this. You have no lawyer, you're considered guilty until you can prove you're innocent, and in the most cruel twist of all, the only way to save your own life was to confess to being a witch and then name other people. If you stood your ground and said you were innocent, that was a death sentence. But maybe the most terrifying part of this whole broken system was the kind of evidence it allowed. It was evidence that was impossible to see. And because of that, it was impossible to fight. It was called spectral evidence, and it is just as mind-boggling as it sounds. An accuser could start screaming in the middle of court, claiming that your ghostly shape, your specter, was pinching them or choking them. Now think about that. Nobody else in the room could see it, but the judges accepted this invisible assault as cold, hard fact. And they even had these bizarre theatrical tests in the courtroom, like the touch test. An afflicted person would be thrashing around and they'd force the accused to touch them. If the fit suddenly stopped, it was seen as proof that the witch had just called back their evil spirit. It was a horrifying no-win situation. And this just brilliantly illustrates the absolute helplessness of the accused. I mean, how do you prove your ghost wasn't somewhere tormenting someone? You can't. Your alibi for where your physical body was totally meaningless against an accusation from an invisible world. So, with a legal system built on fear and fantasy, the outcome was, well, it was inevitable, and it was brutal. The convictions started piling up, and it led to a summer of tragic, state-sanctioned murder. All through the summer of 1692, the hangings just kept coming. Bridget Bishop was first, then respected church members like Rebecca Nurse. Even a former minister, Reverend George Burroughs, who stood on the gallows and recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly, something everyone believed a witch was incapable of doing. It didn't save him. But maybe the most horrific story of all is that of Giles Corey. He was an 81-year-old farmer, and he knew he could never win a trial based on spectral evidence, so he refused to enter a plea at all. The punishment for that was a medieval torture called peine forte et dure. He was slowly crushed to death under heavy stones. It took 2 days. By the time the madness finally broke, 25 innocent people were dead. 19 were hanged. 1 man was pressed to death, and at least 5 others died in the squalid, disease-ridden jails while they waited for their own trials. The trials eventually sputtered out when the accusations started reaching the highest levels of society, including the governor's own wife. That forced everyone to take a step back and reevaluate. But the tragedy left a permanent scar and some profound lessons in its wake. This horrifying failure of justice forced a reckoning, and it directly led to many of the legal principles that protect us today. Just look at this comparison. The idea that you are presumed innocent, not guilty. The right to a lawyer. The rejection of hearsay and gossip as evidence. These absolute core pillars of our justice system were built directly on the ashes of 1692 to make sure this kind of madness could never, ever happen again. Ultimately, the Salem Witch Trials are a permanent warning. It is a terrifying case study of what happens when fear, paranoia, and a complete failure of critical thinking consume a society. And it forces us to look in the mirror and ask ourselves, what are our modern witch hunts? And what happens when we let our own fears override reason?